Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and today I'll be speaking with Micah Redding. Micah is the founder and executive director of the Christian Transhumanist Association and the host of the Christian Transhumanist Podcast. He grew up as a preacher's kid, spent 8 years as a rock musician, and now works as a software developer. He's also a member of Mensa, a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post and Vice Motherboard, and a public speaker. We discuss what it means to be a Christian transhumanist, similarities and conflicts between these beliefs, Micah's vision for the future, and much more. And in case you missed it during our last episode, we plan to send an episode of the Future Grind Podcast to the moon on board Astrobotic's first lunar mission. We plan to send the file on a micro SD card, and we wanted to provide you, the Future Grind audience, an opportunity to fly alongside us by sending your own digital files and photos to the moon. As an individual, this is your opportunity to create a digital time capsule with your story, your family history, and your photos. As a writer, artist, musician, or filmmaker, this is your opportunity to have your work in space. As a company or organization, this is your opportunity to make a splash by sending your logo, business info, or digital product to the lunar surface. All it takes is a $20 donation. To find out more and get involved, visit futuregrind.org/moon. That's futuregrind.org/moon. As always, show notes and links are available at futuregrind.org. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure to subscribe on all of these platforms, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. If you'd like to keep this podcast running, you can donate at futuregrind.org/support, or you can purchase some of our newly released products at futuregrind.org/store. Because of you, this is Future Grind. All right, and now we're here with Micah. Micah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, you're a founder of the Christian Transhumanist Association, or the CTA. What is the CTA, and what's the purpose of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's very unusual for a lot of reasons, but the Christian Transhumanist Association is basically a group of people who are interested in kind of bridging the worlds of faith and kind of radically advanced science and technology. And so we're trying to have a conversation about how that works, and from that conversation develop a better framework to kind of bring the rest of the other billion people in the world into this conversation and into these kinds of movements who might not otherwise be involved. So from there, it just kind of expands. There's lots going on there, but that's kind of the basic premise.
So what does the CTA do? Do you put on programming and events? Do you put out position statements or any deliverables? Or what can people expect from you?
Yeah, so the primary thing we do is create the context for a community. And that community, we do conferences, we have Facebook groups, we have other kinds of forums. We produce like the Christian Transhumanist Podcast. And then we do, from time to time, work on kinds of statements and so forth. But we've mostly not done a lot of that because what we're trying to help happen is for Christians from all kinds of different parts of the tradition to come together and kind of work out what the various concerns and so forth need to be. And so this is primarily what we do is we work through, what is our theology, what is our value system and so forth mean for all these things that are coming up? What does it mean for brain augmentation? What does it mean for all those things? And so we work that out, and that's a conversation. It's an ongoing process. Many of us are trying to process that in a really deep way that might, engage not just kind of on the surface level. But in terms of deliverables, yeah, it tends to come out in things like the conferences and so forth, where we actually kind of have some people put some things to paper or put some things to, to video and audio. And that all becomes part of a process, or it's the output of a process that's going on kind of much longer term behind the scenes.
So before we get too far into this, how do you define transhumanism?
Yeah, so usually I would just define it as it's a movement to use science and technology to transform the human condition. And generally, when I say that, people say, okay, so we're all kind of on board that. Like everybody likes to use science and technology to some extent. So I usually go beyond that. Transhumanists, or people who identify as transhumanists, typically are those who not only want to use science and technology to transform the human condition, but also have a bit of a plan about how to do so and want to take that farther than maybe other people are willing to go.
And just to be clear here, do you self-identify as a transhumanist?
Yes, absolutely.
And so we can understand where you're coming from. You are a Christian, but that could mean a lot of different things. So can you give us a brief understanding of your religious beliefs?
Yeah, a kind of breakdown of Christian religious beliefs is always tricky. But so I grew up as a preacher's kid in a group called the Churches of Christ, which is kind of a Protestant American, roughly evangelical kind of group. That's kind of my background. And basically what this means is, as a Christian transhumanist, I'm using the discipleship of Christ as kind of an ethical guide for what it means to be transhumanist, or where we're going with transhumanism. And so we kind of look at Christ as the exemplar of kind of the ultimate transhumanist direction. And that kind of guides everything. And so one of the big things from that is, like, what is a core ethic? Well, for Christian transhumanists, one of our biggest kind of ethical focuses is the idea that cooperation, trust, compassion, and love, these relational values, really have to be at the center of any kind of thriving future.
There are beliefs that are common among Christians, but I don't want to just assume that you also hold them. So let me know if I'm incorrect with any of the following.
Sure.
You believe in a personal God. You believe that Jesus was the Son of God and was crucified to atone for human sins. You believe in the existence of heaven, and believe that humans have immortal souls that live on after our physical deaths. Is any of that inaccurate?
It's not inaccurate, but I think what we would want to do, especially in kind of these kind of conversations, is put a lot of asterisks on those things, because most of the time when someone says those things or reads those things or imagines what those things mean, they imagine them in a very fundamentalist sense. They imagine them in a kind of magical sense. So it's really disconnected from a kind of world of science and technology. And so, we could go through those and talk about what they might mean given a kind of general transhumanist or scientific or technological framework.
Sure, and I imagine we might be able to get further into some of those beliefs as we talk. But for now, I'd love to find out a bit more about how you became a Christian transhumanist. So it sounds like you grew up with a religion. But how did you come to discover and get involved with transhumanism?
Yeah, so growing up in my religious environment, the main thing we were taught was to study for ourselves. And it was considered like this is our responsibility to understand pretty much everything. And, mostly that's focused on understanding scriptures and so forth. But it also included science, technology, philosophy, theology, all that kind of stuff. And so I took that really seriously from a young age. And so by about the age of 12, I had read so many different atheist writers that I was wondering if I was going to become an atheist as well. And in that kind of process of rethinking what faith actually meant and where it was going and what it was aiming at and so forth, I kind of came to some bigger understandings of the Christian faith. And at the same time, I started encountering transhumanist communities online and transhumanist writings. This was in the 90s. And I recognized a real connection. I recognized that in some ways, these groups of people were, even though mostly very secular, trying to do the same thing that my tradition had been aiming at for 2,000 years.
And there's a belief that I sometimes hear, mainly from critics of transhumanism, that transhumanism itself is a religion. Do you notice any aspects of religion within transhumanism, and how do you view that?
Yeah. So, transhumanism is a movement, and like all movements, there are religious components. Movements are a sort of religious thing in the broadest sense. So, I see, in fact, there are multiple transhumanisms, really, with different kind of ethical ideas, different kind of plans and so forth. And so, anytime you say, okay, what are we going to aim at? And let's essentially take down all the barriers. What are we going to build if we had no limits? Then you're talking in what are ultimately, theological terms. It's like, what kind of heaven can we build? What kind of hell do we need to avoid? And so even though, most transhumanists are not overtly religious in that sense, in, kind of a strong or narrow sense, there is a real connection at that level of asking what is the biggest level of meaning and construction that we can engage in as human beings.
So there's another organization called the Mormon Transhumanist Association.
Yeah.
What's the relationship between these associations? How are they alike and how are they different?
Yeah, so the Mormon Transhumanists, great friends of ours, some overlapping membership because Mormons are generally considered kind of a group of, or a kind of tradition within Christianity. The Mormon Transhumanist Association is kind of focused on specifically ways that their tradition might interface or interact or encourage transhumanism. And so they have some very distinctive things within their tradition, some very distinctive kind of ideas about the future and what they should be building and so forth that really kind of relate to that. The Christian Transhumanist Association is kind of attempting to connect to the entire Christian world. So that includes Catholics, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, all kinds of other things. And so we're kind of drawing from, in some ways, a much more diverse set of Christian traditions. And we're trying to find that kind of common ground that drives towards a workable future that will kind of be a positive for everyone, both Christian and non.
So many Christians seem to believe that through God, all things are possible. That through God, humans are not limited by biology. We are more than our bodies and more than our genes. If through God we're already more than human, do you believe that many Christians are inherently already transhumanists?
Well, yeah, I think when Christians are true to their tradition, to the meaning of what, Christianity is, then they are implicitly transhumanist. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of versions of Christianity that are out there today that are incredibly escapist. And you kind of use the word already, and that's something we might want to unpack there. There's a term in Christianity that's common called already but not yet, which means like we're already there in potential. We're already super intelligences in potential. We're already superpowered beings in potential, but also not yet. And so given that not yet, what are we going to do about it? What do we do now? What's our kind of calling, our role, our job here and now in the present? And when Christians, I think, embrace the truest parts of our tradition, it calls us to actively work to make the world better, to advance those things, to move towards that now in the present, in the world. And when some traditions go escapist and they just try to get out of the world or try to write off the current world, then I think that's when things go wrong. And you see this in secular transhumanism as well. Some people who will get so excited about the singularity or something like that that they don't do anything now to help actually bring things along.
So you were a driving force behind the creation of the Christian Transhumanist Association. But what's the history of Christian transhumanism before you? I am sure these are concepts that have existed even before that word was used. So can you discuss some of the history?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually preparing kind of a test run of a discussion about the Christian history of transhumanism, because Christian transhumanists like myself would look back to Scripture and beyond to say, okay, these ideas are already there. They're already present. But we can also kind of trace it through history after those periods of time where in the what we call the patristic period, like the 300s and so forth, AD, Christians are talking very much about science and technology and how it interacts with these questions. They're saying, okay, we've got this idea that we're going to be involved in raising the dead. scientifically, how is that going to work? And they start working out what they think the process actually looks like. And so, you kind of go and see these ideas traced out through history. A big moment, I think, is Francis Bacon in the early 1600s, writing about his work, The Great Instauration, which was kind of laying out the proposal for the scientific method. And he argues this specifically from his theology. He says, basically, our theology calls us to use science and technology to transform the world, transform the human condition, extend lifespans, and so forth. And he actually describes this in his work, The New Atlantis, a group, an island of transhumanists, and they're Christian transhumanists. And so he doesn't use the word transhumanism, but he's very much describing that kind of a culture. And then we get into the 20th century where Teilhard de Chardin is a Jesuit priest who's trying to reconcile evolution. He's a paleontologist as well. He's trying to reconcile evolution with his religious understanding. And what he comes up with is this vision of life evolving to an omega point and beyond. And he starts using this term transhumanism. And one of his good friends and kind of correspondents is Julian Huxley, who is secular and in some ways launches the idea in his 1957 essay, Transhumanism, launches this idea of transhumanism as a secular movement. So there's a lot of actual interchange between these ideas, both on the religious and the secular side, across history.
I think it's safe to say that most transhumanists want to make the world a better place, and I think that's true of most Christians as well. But I noticed that some Christians seem to be Apocalypse Accelerationists. They believe that prior to the second coming of Jesus, the world will be full of things such as war and famine and economic collapse, and while most people are horrified by these things, they don't seem to mind them, and perhaps try to encourage them, because they feel this is a sign that the second coming that they're looking forward to is drawing near. And they aren't as interested in imagining or building a more positive future here on Earth, because to them, there's no point. What would you say to these people who aren't necessarily motivated to build a better world and are okay watching it burn?
Yeah, I would say that's a bad reading of Christianity, of Scripture, of our tradition entirely, and that's the escapism I talked about earlier, because it flies in the face of so many things that are core to Christianity. One is something called the Lord's Prayer. It's when the disciples of Jesus in the New Testament ask him, "How do we pray?" He gives them kind of a template prayer, and it goes like this. It's like, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And so he is saying the very core prayer that we should be praying as disciples of Christ, as Christians, is that the world becomes like heaven. And in fact, that's the picture, that's the actual picture in the New Testament. You get heaven coming to earth, the new Jerusalem descending into the world. And so unfortunately, we get some of these, like you said, like these kind of apocalyptic accelerationists who are trying to accelerate something bad happening. Those people are not working for the vision that Jesus, the disciples, or the New Testament laid out. And I think whenever I have those conversations with people, mostly they recognize this. Most Christians actually know we're supposed to be working for a better world. We're supposed to be working for the healing of creation. That's our calling. That's who we are.
There's a belief that I've encountered that Christianity and transhumanism are fundamentally opposed, and that the idea of a Christian transhumanist itself is an oxymoron. In fact, the evangelical theologian Russell Moore has been quoted as saying, "There could no more be a Christian transhumanist society than a carnivorous vegan society. The two are completely contradictory."
Yes.
So it's clear that you do not agree with this sentiment.
Right.
But what are the strongest arguments you hear against Christian transhumanism? And are there any aspects of the Christian faith or doctrine that you struggle to integrate with transhumanism?
Yeah, no. So I think the biggest conflict for people is trying to think about what it means to be human, right? And so sometimes the way we talk about transhumanism is kind of leaving humanity behind. And if you say something like that, then that raises all kinds of questions. What part of humanity are we leaving behind? Well, is it our morality? Is it our empathy? Is it our emotions? Those kinds of things. So Christians also have a kind of idea about leaving humanity behind, but they also talk about the advancement of humanity. And so this is where the conflict comes for most people, is just what it means to be human, and whether we're talking about getting rid of it or amplifying it, or taking the good parts to a higher level, something like that. So I would say fundamentally there is no conflict. Both Christianity and transhumanism are looking at the transformation of humanity to a higher state, to a greater form, a greater level of life and thriving and relationship and all those kinds of things. And over the years, I've been kind of publicly involved in kind of advancing Christian transhumanism. The transhumanist side of it has made more sense out of my faith than anything else I've encountered. I'm a stronger Christian today because of transhumanism than otherwise. And it's really a strong Christianity that makes me a transhumanist. And so for me, these are totally complementary. But, for a lot of people, yeah, it comes down to that question: what does it mean to be human? What are we leaving behind, and what are we taking forward?
And are there any specific parts of the Bible, perhaps certain books, stories, or verses, that you would point to as an example of transhumanist thought or messaging?
Yeah, so I would say it's all through it, and I would so it's more about the narrative and where the narrative is aiming than it is pulling out a verse that says, okay, there's going to be robots or something like that. But what you get from Genesis 1, first page of the Bible, is God is this creator and cultivator of life. God calls life into being, and then God looks at it and says, okay, that's great. Now I'm going to make another being like myself who can do the same job. And so God calls humanity to, in the biblical term, rule over all things, to bring flourishing life to the entirety of creation, the entirety of the cosmos, and starts guiding them through that. And so from the very first pages of the Bible, you get them using tools, creating new things, musical instruments, art, all this kind of stuff, naming and categorizing creation in a scientific way. That's the understanding in the oldest kind of core scriptures of what it is to be human. It is to be a scientific and technological being. And you see this play out. One of the interesting stories that you get is the story of Noah's Ark, right? Which a lot of people are familiar with. It's been made into big motion pictures, all this kind of stuff. The story is essentially that there is a cataclysmic existential destruction coming. So God calls Noah to construct the largest technological artifact the ancient world could have conceived to save all life. And so what you see in that story is then a human, a God, and technology working together to save the world. And that becomes the Bible's primary metaphor and template for what salvation, redemption, the renewal of the world actually is. And when you get to the New Testament, then what it shows us is that this involves the entire cosmos. The entire cosmos is waiting to be brought to life by humans and our intelligence that we kind of bring into existence.
Yeah, I think that Noah's Ark is an example of a major technological project that was undertaken for a noble purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that ended up working out. But there are other grand projects in the Bible, and some of them did not work out. I think a good example of this would be the Tower of Babel.
Right.
This project did not please God, and it didn't end so great.
Right.
So how do you, as a Christian transhumanist, determine which scientific or technological projects should be pursued and which are something we should not attempt? Do you have any criteria for this?
Yeah, totally. So what we're looking for is basically just what uplifts life, right? So we are looking for things that empower people, things that empower communities, things that empower humanity as a whole, things that empower, ultimately all living things, right? We want more flourishing for the entire kind of ecosystem ultimately. And so what you have in Babel, and it's kind of a tricky story, but what you have in Babel is the reverse of Noah's Ark, right? They're back to back. You have one version of technology being used to save the world, and then you have a version of technology that is actually being used to bring about tyranny, if you read the story carefully. And so they're trying to actually reject the human calling that had just been emphasized in the story of Noah, is that humans are to cultivate life. They're to spread into all the world, all creation, bringing life into being. And the people of Babel say, we don't want to do that. We don't want to go out and kind of do the hard work of science and technology and cultivating life. We want to stay here where things are safe and sound and we know everything we need to know and never take any risks. And so they're actually trying to use technology to avoid risk taking, to avoid actually having to struggle to bring new things into being. And so that's what we want to look out for. Anytime we start to try to shut down progress by shutting down risk taking, by thinking we can kind of build a walled society or a closed society that's going to protect us from all threats, and so we never have to do anything, that's when we have a good indication we're going in the wrong direction.
When you point to Genesis as a calling for humans to go forth and create and explore and be a scientific species, do you see that as applying to just Earth, or do you read that as a calling to venture throughout the solar system and beyond?
Yeah, definitely the solar system and beyond. Of course, those things are written in a context where, people don't know very much about the solar system and beyond. And so creation is taken to be, mostly like looked at as part of the earth, and so forth. But as you kind of progress through the Bible, what you see is that the writers increasingly say, we said go into all creation. And all means all. You see that in the Psalms where they reiterate this idea. And those Psalms become huge in the New Testament, to where the New Testament writers such as Paul, who writes most of the books in the New Testament, or the author of Hebrews, look at that and say, all means all. That means everything. And so Hebrews actually spells this out. It says, everything invisible, visible, invisible, things present, things to come, that is our domain. That is what we are given charge of. Go out and do this. And so it literally understands it to be the entire cosmos. Paul says, all creation waits in expectation for the children of God, that being us, to be revealed, in hopes that the creation itself can come to participate in the glory, the freedom and the glory of the children of God. So Paul sees the entire cosmos as waiting for us to kind of wake up, get ourselves in gear so we can do the job we've been called to do.
From my understanding, many Christians believe that humans are created by God, and each human has an immortal soul. So the concept of self and identity seems pretty established and concrete in this scenario. But when we talk about the future of science and technology, things can get complicated. It might be good to consider what makes us human and what makes us ourselves, and when we may cross the line into something else. For example, what do we make of human and non-human hybrids? What if we become non-biological? What if we upload minds? What if we make multiple copies of that digital consciousness? The list could go on. Do you have any thoughts on how these complexities of self and identity might be viewed from a Christian perspective?
Yeah, so there are probably no easy answers here, but interestingly, these are the same questions that, were posed to Christians in the first few centuries, because they were saying, and it was quite audacious in the ancient world, they were saying, we are going to have transformed our bodies, transformed ourselves. We're going to be physically reconstituted and become these incredible beings that we can't even now comprehend. And then we're going to live forever. and so people are saying, well, how do you know it's you? What does it mean to have a transformed, body? Is that even a coherent concept? And the New Testament kind of deals with this sort of thing. Paul writes about it in 1 Corinthians 15, about the nature of different bodies and how that might, different kinds of things have different bodies, and what all that might mean. mean? So Paul uses the idea of a spiritual body. And what he means by that is a body that is not fixed, but is open-ended and transforming, always kind of in the process of becoming. For Paul, the Spirit is that which creates new things. So he contrasts kind of a natural body, which is pretty much fixed with, a current kind of framework, and we understand, pretty much what it's going to do, with a spiritual body, which will keep transforming forever. And that's what Paul sees as kind of the ultimate thing, that when we become what we are supposed to become, it's going to look like this spiritual body, this spiritual process of transformation. And so it's open-ended. There is no ultimate kind of thing we can nail down and say, this is the part that we hold on to. For Paul, it's actually that ongoing process of transformation and creativity, which is us. It's to embrace that process, which is to hold on to our identity. So ironically, for Paul, to give up the opportunity for transformation would be to give up our identity and who we are.
So taking this a step further, some people believe that artificial intelligences could achieve consciousness. In your view, could something like this make sense from a Christian perspective? And if so, how would these intelligences fit into Christianity? Would they have a soul, and could they be saved?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a sense, we would say like the entire cosmos is to be saved, and not because the entire cosmos is, something like full of sin or something like that, but, it's subject to decay. It's subject to all kinds of things. And so all of it needs to be renewed ultimately, or brought to life, which, life would be the highest kind of thriving form of matter, let's say. And so, so AI definitely would be part of that. And that includes AI as it is today, which we have, narrow AI. That needs to be part of this renewal. But it also includes future AI, AGI, general intelligence, broad intelligence, which would be somewhat like us. And in a Christian framework, we have to say that there are other intelligences possible. That's part of that discussion of, even the idea of like an angel or, a spirit or something like this. It's this idea that there are other intelligences that might come into being. And absolutely, we are empowered to do that in the Christian narrative. It's actually, I would say, kind of spelled out that we have a relationship to angels where, it's conceivable we could be bringing them into being, what Scripture would use those terms for.
And I've seen some comments from Christians claiming that the Christian Transhumanist Association is the work of Satan, and that you either are possessed by or actually are a demon. And I know this is probably not representative of how you're seen within the church.
Sure.
But these beliefs do exist.
Sure.
How have your interactions been with Christians who have a more critical view of transhumanism?
Yeah, so, I would say the broadest group of Christians who are part of things like Anglicanism or Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, the mainline Protestant churches, things like this that are kind of fit into what most people would call orthodoxy. Most of them might have a hesitant view of transhumanism because it's the question of what it is to be human. That really is at the core of it. But they would recognize that what we're pulling from is the same sources they are. And so, some of the biggest people for me, some of the biggest influences are people like C.S. Lewis, Anglican theologian N.T. Wright. These are some of the most prominent Christian thinkers in the world, and people who adhere to those people are inspired by them tend to resonate a lot with what we're doing. But you do have like fringe groups who, think that we're ushering in, the apocalypse, ushering in the beast, something like this. And I've talked with those folks, and most of them are kind of conspiracy thinkers. Anything they're going to interpret in this kind of way. And, we have friendly exchanges for the most part, but some people are just going to see it that way no matter what. But I think the more kind of broad mainstream versions of Christianity are going to be open to these kinds of discussions and open to a really transformative technological future.
So to me, this sounds like an issue over which there could be a schism, with some parts of the church being open to transhumanism and some parts strongly opposing it. Do you foresee this as being an issue, And how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, it's interesting. Roughly 500 years ago, we had the Protestant Reformation, which is, one of the big historic kind of schisms in Christian history. And it came about because of the printing press, arguably. So you get the printing press, you get a new way of kind of distributing information, and all of a sudden the information monopoly of the Catholic Church doesn't really work anymore. And I think we're kind of in a similar period, with the internet. The internet is the second printing press. And so what we have is churches in general having to deal with this radical new way that information is being transmitted and communicated and formed and so forth. So I kind of see it as leading to a reformation, but it's not going to be because, someone like us stood up and said, here's a new way. It's actually already underway. It's already happening. We're already seeing this crisis in churches around the world. And so what my hope is that Christian transhumanism offers a way to reintegrate some of these things and offers a healthier way forward than some of the more fringe or radical options that are being offered right now.
So we discussed how you're viewed as a transhumanist in the Christian community, but now let's explore how you're viewed as a Christian in the transhumanist community. Many transhumanists would identify as skeptics and would call themselves atheists or agnostic. So how have you and your beliefs been received in the transhumanist community?
Yeah, so CTA is affiliated with Humanity Plus, one of the oldest transhumanist organizations. And so, and I work with the Transhumanist Party. I'm advisor for them. So I think there's a lot of friendliness, and you also get, what you kind of expect, some pushback in terms of, well, you can't really be a Christian and a transhumanist or something like that. I think a lot of people are, recognize that people kind of need some kind of spirituality. And so they kind of accept it on those terms. Everyone needs some kind of spirituality, or many people do, not everyone. And then you have people who are like, well, everybody believes in something crazy, so that's okay. So we get everything from, acceptance, embrace, to, people really kind of thinking it's crazy or thinking it's contradictory.
So I do quite a bit of work in the human augmentation community, and this often deals with implanted technology for non-medical purposes. Mm-hmm. And RFID tags, which can be used to authenticate identity or make payments, are a common example of this. And whenever we get media attention for some of these things, the commenters always go to the mark of the beast.
Right.
And this is something that I hear over and over again.
Right.
So I'd love to hear if you have any advice on how transhumanists or biohackers can address these concerns in a way that is respectful and that doesn't diminish these concerns that many people clearly have.
Yeah, well, I usually just ask, okay, so if the mark of the beast is, a microchip or something like that, then what's the mark of God? Because there's two marks in that story. So I'm like, well, what is that? An implanted quantum computer? So if you're going to say that one of them is some kind of technology, you need to be able to say that the other one is too. And I feel like most people who talk about the mark of the beast don't do this, right? They don't follow the story to its logical conclusion. And so, the real concern there is if you kind of get away from just like a, attempt to do a literalist reading of the text or something like that. The real concern is, are we using technologies to empower people or to enslave them? And that's the question. Are we removing people's agency with these technologies, or are we giving people agency? And so the mark of the beast in that story is something that removes people's agency. It limits them in some way. It reduces them to being kind of vassals of the evil empire, so to speak. And so what I would want to talk about is to say, well, how can this technology actually empower people to be more free, more liberated, more empowered, have more agency in regard to their technology, in regard to the way that they're communicating with people and so forth. And yeah, I would talk about some of those things.
So a few of the upcoming questions are from Jacob Boss, who is an academic studying the intersection between religion and transhumanism. And he asks, How is the desire to radically alter the body understood from a CTA perspective? Is it okay to want to change yourself for reasons of beauty, sexuality, gender, or curiosity?
Well, I mean, we've been changing ourselves since the very beginning. Ear piercings, everything, clothing, right? Clothing is one of the first enhancements. Adapting ourselves. Cooked food, fire. We've adapted our biology to the new technologies, and so, what are the legitimate things? Well, all of them, essentially. People use these things for adornment, for aesthetics, for protection, all that kind of stuff. All those things are good. In saying that the material world is good, which is a core Christian idea, we're saying that we have the prerogative to use it, to transform ourselves, to do all these things in any way that's life-giving. So if you want to think about what that is it helping you to have more relationship and more creativity? That's essentially, what it boils down to. And so, there are ways that you could think about that you might modify your body that cut you off from relationship to people. And so that's where you would want to be careful. But as long as it's in increasing your creativity, increasing your ability to connect and relate to others, to have genuine relationship, then I think it's good. It's on the table. It's part of what it means to be human, and certainly part of what it means to be a Christian transhumanist.
So kind of on that note then, is it the CTA's position that body modification and enhancement should be protected forms of religious expression?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think in some ways it has to be, right. It is part of what it is to be human, to modify yourself, and so obviously that can get into lots of tricky territory. The primary thing we want to keep in focus, as I was saying, is really just agency, right? But I think yes. I mean, I think that the CTA has no official position on that topic, but I think we would want to say that this is part of our calling ultimately, and if we're talking about this in a healthy, productive, relational way, then yes.
So there are many potential futures that transhumanists are working towards. Things like radically increasing the human lifespan, mind uploading, integrating human and machine, exploring the universe, and much more. But as a Christian transhumanist, how would you describe the future that you want to see?
Yeah, definitely. So some big things, that are high priority because they come from the mouth of Jesus himself is curing diseases, healing sickness, extending life. Those sorts of things are big priorities for me and for a lot of Christian transhumanists. We want to see more thriving, healthy, relational life, less disease, longer lifespans, all that kind of stuff. Personally, I want to see a solar system wide civilization. I think we need to fill the solar system, and we need to fill the solar system with life. And there's a lot of reasons for that, I think, that are going to be really significant. One is we've got to get good at managing ecosystems. We've got to manage this one, and we need to help it actually thrive, not just kind of mitigate damage, but actually take it to a new level. And, even in a virtual world or a digital world, those ultimately become ecosystems. And so we need to understand how ecosystems work. And the clearest way I know to do that is to start growing ecosystems elsewhere. The universe is a test tube for growing ecosystems. And so we need to be doing that actively, in part so we can understand how to help Earth flourish and thrive, but also so we can have these ecosystems where we help specific things, come into being. Some big things that I think we should be considering are, de-extinction of animal species that have been here. Those are some big things I particularly think we need. I think we also want, people who are very interested in brain augmentation understand it as a way for us to help kind of keep up with the AI, right? And I think this is an important area of thinking and research, not just kind of on the technical side, but what does it mean for us to enable ourselves to keep growing and keep advancing our intelligence so that we don't get stuck. I think that's really critical for us to think about right now, because the world is already filled with non-human intelligence and this kind of decentralized social intelligence, and we need to think about what it means for us to keep growing in that context.
Those are all important things to consider. But I think another important topic here is death. I'd say that most Christians believe that they have a soul that will live on after their physical deaths.
Mm-hmm.
Many transhumanists, who might be atheist or agnostic, believe that if they die, they are gone forever. There's no soul and nothing after death.
Right.
To me, that would mean that the stakes are much higher for many non-Christian transhumanists, and that death may not necessarily be that big of a deal for Christian transhumanists. What are your thoughts on this, and how does it impact your thoughts on your own death?
Yeah, so I feel like in the Christian story, as Paul says, the last enemy to be defeated is death. So Christianity sees death as this ultimate enemy, and essentially, I think as people like Irenaeus in the early centuries of the Christian era thought of it, we were supposed to have defeated death already. Essentially, if humanity had done what it was supposed to, we would have defeated death, we would have solved all these problems, and we would all be immortal. But we took a wrong turn, and that didn't happen. And so our job, essentially, is to get back on the path to defeating death. And Paul says that's what Christ has brought into the world, that Christ has given us the ability to get back on that path so we can defeat death. So it's absolutely part of the Christian calling. It's part of the Christian narrative of what's going to happen once people, do the right thing, so to speak. But yeah, we also have this idea that, of course, defeating death means that we get to bring people back who are already dead, right? It's not just that death is defeated for the people who happen to still be living at the time. It's that ultimately death can be defeated for everyone. And so there are a lot of people who are thinking right now about things like quantum archaeology and so forth. What would it look like to try to de-extinct individuals as well, right? As well as species. And so, there's a lot of potential exploration there of what that might entail, what that might look like, what it means to have historical records and what we can learn from them, and what we can learn from the records we ourselves leave behind. And so, yeah, I hope to avoid death. I hope to have as long of a life as possible. And then if I die, I hope that someone brings me back. And that's part of what I think a faith or a religion can kind of bring to this, is that there's always risk. There's always, even if you get cryonically frozen, there's always the risk somebody, who's going to unfreeze you ultimately, right? You need somebody kind of waiting who wants you to come back. And I think that's an important part of the Christian faith here. We need a community who is invested in actually bringing us back from death.
You had mentioned thinkers such as C.S. Lewis and N.T. Wright as people who have had an impact on you. But is there anyone else or any specific writings that you'd recommend for anyone who wants to learn more?
Yeah, sure. So N.T. Wright has a book called Surprised by Hope, which lays out what he would call the Orthodox Christian view of the afterlife and the future. And he's writing, of course, in theological terms, not scientific or technological terms. But what he's describing is that our world, our cosmos, this earth and everything around it is to be transformed, renewed, and we are supposed to overcome death here. And that's what he points to as this is the historic Christian view. This is the oldest, most authentic Christian view. And I think that's a real resource for people who are, coming from a different view or who find that idea surprising. And so I think that, I would start there for someone who wants to understand it from a Christian perspective. There's also been Christian transhumanist writings or, Christian transhumanist friendly writings that have gone on over time. I mentioned Teilhard de Chardin. He's writing in the 1930s. His book was published in 1955. I think The Phenomenon of Man is where he kind of lays out his kind of view of the future. And the foreword to that book was written by Julian Huxley, prominent secular transhumanist I mentioned earlier. You also get, in the 90s, you get Frank Tipler writes a book called The Physics of Immortality, where he imagines what would happen if life and intelligence were to take over the cosmos, to bring it to life, to live forever, to experience infinite power, and then to resurrect the dead, and all these things. And his view like integrates that kind of a ultimate transhumanist vision with, the Christian narrative. Now, the science he's laying out doesn't hold now. Like we've changed our understanding of what the cosmos is, but in terms of imagining how these things might fit together, I think that's a really powerful one, because he's actually just describing these things in physical, technical terms, what it might mean for all those theological claims to come true.
I'll make sure to put links to those resources in the show notes at futuregrind.org for anyone who wants to check them out. And if people are interested in finding out more about the Christian Transhumanist Association or following along with you and your work, how can they do that?
Yeah, so ChristianTranshumanism.org is our website. It has links to a lot of stuff. You can find things we've written, interviews, that kind of stuff. And it will link you to the Facebook group, which is probably currently our biggest area of interaction. And, I'm also fairly active on Twitter, Micah T. Redding, and I have a website where I publish some essays on some of this stuff and other Christian theological topics, micahredding.com. I've written there about things like the physics of resurrection and so forth, or how we think about that theologically, at least. So yeah, those would be what I would point people to.
There were so many things that I wanted to touch on in this episode, and we got through some of them, but I think the topics we discussed here deserve a much deeper dive. So perhaps we can do a round 2 at some point. Until then, Micah, thanks again for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been great to be here. Thanks for your questions. I'd love to join you in the future.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with Micah. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. We also need your help to keep this podcast running. You can donate at futuregrind.org/support, or make a purchase at futuregrind.org/store. And don't forget, we're offering you the opportunity to send your files and photos to the moon alongside an episode of this podcast. To find out more, go to futuregrind.org/moon. That's futuregrind.org/moon. Till next time, this is Future Grind.